Welcome to the Working Genius podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Patrick Lencioni, and I'm your host today, joined by Cody Thompson.
How's it going?
Tracy Noble.
Hi, Pat.
And Matt Lencioni.
Hi there.
This is the core team, and these early podcasts on Working Genius, we're all going to do this because it's fun to talk about it. Today's topic is, Cody?
Stop feeling guilty at work.
That's right. Stop feeling guilty at work. Guilt and judgment are 2 of the worst things that plague people in relationships and in life. Feeling unnecessarily guilty and judging others or feeling judged. And the Working Genius model, by understanding our geniuses and the geniuses of others, we can drastically reduce guilt and judgment at work, which makes everything better.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we spend a ton of time on this podcast and exploring this model with how it helps teams be more productive, which it does. And that's like a wonderful use of this tool.
The first and most practical benefit.
But the underlying, what we almost call this like the greatest social impact of this thing. And the underlying social impact is that we get to relieve ourselves of unnecessary guilt and get to relieve relationships and workplace relationships and interpersonal relationships from unnecessary judgment. And if it were that alone, it would be wonderful. And
Absolutely.
On top of that, we get to do more with this tool.
And that's not to say that all guilt and all judgment are wrong. There's a lot of problems in the world because you need to feel some guilt around this. But so much of our guilt is unnecessary. And in fact, it's completely inappropriate because we just don't understand how God makes us. And then we feel bad for who we are. And when you finally figure out, oh, these are my geniuses, you can stop feeling bad about the ones you don't have.
Yeah, and this is probably an appropriate time to talk about the fundamental attribution error before we get into it. Or is it?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So the fundamental attribution error is something I learned in college, one of the very few things I still remember from college, and that I learned it in social psychology, and it just is basically this. When other people do things that kind of annoy us, we attribute it to them having an internal problem, a character flaw. So we attribute that to you have a fundamental problem. When we do things that annoy other people, we attribute it to our environment. So we give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, but other people we think have a flaw.
And we judge them as a result.
And so we judge them.
We make an internal attribution.
Right. The guy cuts you off in traffic. You go, what a jerk that guy is. I wanted to call him a dick, but I can't say that on a podcast. But what a jerk that guy is.
Good thing we don't know how to bleep things out.
I know it. But when we cut somebody off in traffic, we're like, I'm really late. I'm sorry. It's a bad day. And the more you understand, St. Francis of Assisi said, seek to understand others more than to be understood. And the more we understand other people and ourselves, the less likely we are to judge them or even ourselves. And we judge ourselves all the time. One of the classic ways we do that, like I have no tenacity. That's not one of my working genius. It's one of my working frustrations. I always felt like I was lazy.
Mm-hmm.
And I still, to this day, I say to people, yeah, I'm lazy. And they're like, you're lazy? I'm like, yeah, I don't like to finish things. And I don't love crossing things off a list. And now I realize it's just not my genius. And I can give myself a break.
It's interesting. Since we started this model, or since we discovered it, I've gone back into these historical narratives, like even from high school.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine, I actually just did a Working Genius session for my friend from high school who had tenacity. And even before she took the assessment, I was thinking about her, and I was like, I bet she had tenacity because she was the one in high school that every day said, did you do your homework, or did you study for the test? And she was incredibly book smart and was the one that prodded me to finish things. And I didn't realize at the time, like, oh, she has tenacity and I don't. I just thought I was a bad student and I was barely getting by, and that was it. And so I felt this guilt and shame over, man, I'm never going to be a good student. When really what it was is that's my working frustration. I didn't realize that I'm not naturally wired to want to do those things. Now, I still have to.
Well, that's the thing. People will say, well, does this mean that when you figure you don't have that genius, hey, you're off the hook, you don't have to do it? No, it's not an excuse. What it means is when you do have to do it, don't expect yourself to love it. Be okay with yourself for going, oh, this is a grind. And don't make that a big part of your job. But all of us have to do things that are not in our working genius sometimes. Mm-hmm. And it's good to go, oh yeah, I'm going to offer this up because I'm terrible at doing this, but I'm going to make myself do it. I'm going to do it as good as I can, but I'm not going to beat myself up for not loving it.
So I have T in my working competency. And it's interesting. You guys both felt like maybe you were lazy. I felt for years, for 22 years, my job was all T. I actually felt like maybe I had a bad attitude. I knew I wasn't lazy, but I thought, man, do I have a bad attitude? Because I don't know why I'm not super fulfilled right now in what I'm doing. I love the people that I work with, but man, it was frustrating at times.
And this can go on for years.
And it's not just, I mean, we're using T as the analogy.
Exactly.
Or
It's across the board.
Horse here, but it could be like someone saying you don't have invention, and you can judge someone as being like, oh, you can't think of any new ideas. You might be stupid,
right.
Or you're not creative, or why can't you think of something? When I ask you, like, you know, it plays out in the, do you have a better idea? And they're like, well, no, I don't really, I'm not an inventor, but we don't have that language for it.
Right. And even when it comes to the concept of disrupting or responding, you know, the different geniuses have different ways of doing that. So if you're a wonderer, a discerner, and an enabler, you tend to be a responder. You don't change the world you respond to what's brought to you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's extremely valuable. But if you're an inventor or a galvanizer, or tenacity is your genius, you are a disruptor. And we had a guy write in that worked in a church and said, he is completely a responder, and he feels really bad that he doesn't go out and like wrestle things to the ground and push people to get things done. And he felt guilty about that. And he asked for our advice. And the idea is you should just go to people and go, that's not my genius.
Totally.
And stop feeling bad for the way you were made. All you have to do, Matt, you're not a disruptor, are you?
No.
All three of his top are in the responsive genius.
And remember, early on, we were tempted to, even your dad, I was tempted to like judge, like, don't you care? Why aren't you pushing for this stuff? And then we did your results. We're like, oh, all three of Matt's top are responsive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And now you don't feel guilty for that. We understand that. Now, we did tell you there's some things we need you to be proactive about, but we know that that's going to be a little bit of a challenge for Matt, so we can be patient.
And we don't make like that fundamental attribution error where we're saying like, oh, that means that he doesn't care.
This happens all the time in jobs.
Because otherwise, without that language, without that context, we might look at Matt and go, hey, you don't speak up enough, or you don't actively, proactively engage in the conversation. You must not care. We go, oh, you know what? He's a responder. Let me just prompt him a little bit. And when I ask you what you're thinking, or when I prod you to say, what are you working on? It's always it shows that you do care. You're caring the whole time, but it's just that responsiveness that keeps you from wanting to like disrupt and say it proactively.
Yeah. And that is something that I felt really guilty about before we clarified it with this model. I used to feel like I had no work ethic. And that's why I actually remember I didn't want to come work here after I graduated, because I thought I hadn't really developed a work ethic yet.
Wow.
Even to the point where I felt like I was just weak and scared to do things.
And you're just responsive.
Yeah.
That's so powerful to think that without realizing that you can go through your life and your career, and thank you, God, that you've figured that out, Matt, that you can go through your career being down on yourself for something that is absolutely natural and fine.
Mm-hmm. I had a personal revelation here too, when early on during this model, where you and I are both ENFPs in the Myers-Briggs, Pat, and I'd worked here for 5 years at the time before this, and when you were gone, they would hand me the pen or the whiteboard marker and go, hey, go do your best Pat impression up there. You're both ENFPs. We need some ENFP on this. And I'd go up there and I could do okay. Invention is in my competency, but it's not one of my working genius. And it turns out that was invention. But before I knew it was invention, I would go home, I'd be driving home and I'm like, well, why can Pat do this stuff that I can't do? And I'd feel guilty. Like, I remember thinking, do I listen to too many podcasts, or do I watch too much TV? Like
you're
am I
not
clouding my
exercising
brain
your
with all this
invention
stuff?
brain.
and then you'd come back and you'd undo some of the stuff that I did. And I would feel guilty. And it wasn't until we had this model where I was like, oh my gosh, this makes all the sense in the world. Pat is an inventor. Let me just let him be the inventor instead of silently feel guilty that I can't do what you do.
Right. And it's funny because Matt, when we came in here to do this podcast, you were like, I think some of these geniuses, if people don't have them, they feel guiltier around. And like we already talked about, we're not T, and then some people are. But even like enablement, I was telling you that I've always felt really bad for not having the genius of enablement. Because when people ask me to do things and they want me to help them in the way they've already determined they want or need, it's really tough for me just to agree. Mm-hmm. It's so hard not to use my invention or my discernment. And sometimes I just have to help them the way they need. When people ask me to be on their board of directors, and a number of companies have. I always say this: if you want to put me on your board so you can write it on the sheet, that's fine. But I'm not going to come to the meetings. I'll just do whatever you want me to do.
Yeah.
But sitting in a board of directors meeting, which I've done before, is one of the most functions in the world, because there's an agenda and you sit there and you listen and you go through this. There's no invention. There's no discernment really until some tiny parts. And I just realized putting myself in a position to do that is really not good for me. It's not because I'm not kind. It's because I don't have that skill.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I think we've talked about this in the past, that, and I think it applies here, is we tend to value, even inadvertently value, because I like discerning and galvanizing. So inadvertently, I appreciate people who have the same skill set as me. So I'm like, I like it when somebody goes out there and galvanizes. That
They're
gets
smart.
me energized, And until we have this framework where we realize, we all need each other and we're all bringing different things to the table. I remember there was a guy that we worked with where every time we'd bring him in to show him what we're working on, I'd get so bummed out because I would like get him in the room and be like, hey, look at all this stuff we're working on. And I would do my best galvanizer, let's get some passion and energy behind this. And then it wasn't reciprocated. And I never felt like he left the room.
Why isn't he excited?
Yeah. And then he'd go out and he'd go do his thing. And then finally, it was actually bringing him in to help with Working Genius one meeting. And we had him take the test. And I was like, oh my gosh, he has galvanizers in his working frustration. And it totally reframed the way that I thought about him.
And you know what's funny? Once we came up with the model, but he hadn't taken the test or the assessment, we actually thought he was a galvanizer.
Right.
So he's a tall, happy guy. He looks like the kind of person to be like, let's go, boys, let's get this done. And he's not.
He was like, I hate that.
And we were like, oh, we thought you just didn't care.
In a way, we were bringing him in to say, hey, go out there and galvanize this thing with everybody else. And it wasn't happening. And we were like, does he not get excited about what we're doing here? Is he not passionate about that? And instead it was just, we were feeling unnecessary or judgment around something that wasn't his genius.
Here's another note we got from Alana. And she said that doing the Working Genius released so much guilt for her because she thought she was lazy about wanting a job. She said, I always wanted a job where people would just call me all day and just bounce ideas off me, but I don't have to be the one to execute those ideas. She said, that must mean I'm lazy. And sometimes in meetings, she would actually hold back her ideas because she didn't want somebody to say, that's a great idea, now go execute it, because she hates executing. And she said, understanding that I'm actually gifted in coming up with and evaluating ideas, but not so much in executing them, has allowed her to use that language at work. And when she does have to execute, she doesn't feel bad about it. She just recognizes it goes against the grain.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the thought that Alana feels less guilty about herself, I don't know how many years she would go to work and go, man, I wish I weren't so lazy.
Yeah.
And now there are people in the world that are kind of lazy, but it's not. But if it's not because you have the wrong genius.
Yeah. You know what? It's interesting that as we're talking about this, I'm thinking it's not just that we are relinquishing guilt and judgment. It's actually flipping it entirely on its head.
Yes.
It's that, because I remember, Tracy, I mean, how many times have I screwed up my calendar or something here at work where I plan something and I screw it up because it involves details. I'm not good at details. I always thought it was like an ENFP thing, but it turns out it's that compounded with my working frustrations. But I used to look at what you did, Tracy, and legitimately think it was magic. Like the fact that you could help people and finish things. And I felt guilty that whole time. But at the same time, I was like in such awe of that. And now I actually get to look at that and celebrate rather than feel guilty. I get to go, oh my gosh, this person over here has this skill that I don't have. And guess what? They know I don't have it. And so now I don't have to feel guilty about it. We can just celebrate the fact that we need each other.
That's so cool.
Tracy, you and I were talking before how early when Matt started and we were working on this model, that he was actually better than I was.
Mm-hmm.
My 22-year-old son was better than I was at some of the things about coming up with a model.
Yep.
And that I could go, oh my gosh, I can't do what he can do. That is so cool.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things about this is when you recognize other people's genius, it shouldn't be a threat to you. It should be an exciting thing to celebrate and thank them for.
Absolutely.
Somebody once said that the definition of humility, or one way of definition, is that when you can walk by a cathedral and look at it and be proud of it as though you had built it yourself.
Mm.
In other words, you didn't have to be the one to like, oh, why couldn't I have done that? And I loved when Tracy does something, or Matt, or you, Cody, and I'm like, I couldn't do that. That is so cool that you can. But if you don't have language around that, you can usually just beat yourself up.
This is a slightly different spin, and we didn't talk about this before the podcast. So I'm a D. I have the genius of discernment. And I'm your editor, Pat. And you and I would often sit in a room and you would write this fantastic book and I would have to give you feedback. And I always felt so guilty for that. It was so painful for me. But now I have the language. Now that we have the language that I'm a discerner, I'm completely free of that guilt right now. Completely free of it. Because you need that from me.
Absolutely. Remember the guy that wrote into us and said, yeah, I thought my wife hated me because he was an inventor and she was a discerner, because he'd say, I have an idea. And she'd go, well, what about this? And he'd be like, can't you just love my ideas? Yeah. And he finally realized on his wedding anniversary, they did this. He goes, oh, she just loves me. That's how she helps me.
Yeah.
I mean, like you said, Cody, this isn't just reducing guilt. It's turning it into a form of service.
Yeah.
That's right.
And appreciation.
Right. And so when people say like, who should I marry? And it's like, should I marry somebody just like me or just different? And it's like, whatever it is, appreciate the fact that they can do things that you can't, and be thankful for the things you got in common, and it'll be great. Mm-hmm. But so many times people are like, why are you like that?
Well, it's crazy. And you could feel guilty for your gifts as well. I mean, and it's crazy that I feel guilty having the genius of enablement. I almost feel like, oh, I'm too soft.
Right.
I get taken advantage of. And it's like, no, I love to support people. I love to help.
Which is why it's so amazing to sit across from another person and go, oh my gosh, do you know how critical it is that you have the gifts that you have and how you bring it to
And their
this
answer
team?
is no.
Right. And we need to constantly be reminding people. We haven't even, and it goes for every genius. I mean, we haven't talked about the wonder. How much do we appreciate and need to spend time thanking wonders for posing great questions and for responding to the environment?
I have Kevin, who's a pastor at a church. He wrote here, I feel guilty for being a wanderer because there's a sense that I'm wasting time. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the gifts of a wanderer, is they can sit and ponder things, and they have to spend time doing it. And people can go, what are you doing right now? Are you being productive? And they're like, yeah, I'm doing the first stage in any kind of work.
Totally.
And that is, but what's funny, he said, is what he doesn't have is invention and discernment, which are huge for pastors. He said, I felt like I was a bad pastor because I couldn't do those things. Mm-hmm. And so here he was doing this job, serving God, serving his people. But because he didn't have those two things, he thought, well, I'm a failure. Now he realizes, gee, I'm a wanderer and a galvanizer, and that's enough. I come up with questions. Other people answer them. When they do it well, I go out and I get everybody excited and to moving forward.
And I would bet that there's so many wanderers out there who are welcoming this conversation right now, because actually there's not very many job descriptions that are written for wanderers out there, and
it's true.
And in fact, I was just having a conversation with a friend who works at a church, and he figured out that he's a wanderer discerner, and they're trying to craft a new job for him. And he's trying to use the working genius as like the model for, hey, here's the value I can add. And they're having a hard time going like, but what is that? What do we write down? What do you do? And it's so interesting to be able to have a team. And this is where I think it's really important that knowing your genius is great, but bringing that to your team or to your marriage or to your relationships is really the game changer. Because when you have a team that can look at this and recognize, hey, the value of wonder is just as valuable as every other letter.
Right.
And how do we tap into that more? And Amy, who's the wanderer here, one of the things that we've been saying, she used to say like, hey guys, I thought I mentioned that before. And she has these, what we used to call tiny pink flags.
Yeah. Like we'd say, why didn't you wave a red flag on that, Amy? She goes, I think I did.
Right. And so now because we have this language, because we know she's the wanderer, anytime I think she's waving a pink flag, in my mind, I always make it bright red.
And on fire.
Well, anytime Amy asks a question, now we all sort of pause. We're like, okay, we need to listen to this.
Right. Whereas she used to say, do you think that we should do something different? We used to go, oh, no, Amy. Yeah. Now it's like, if you think so, we better listen to this.
Totally.
Yeah. And she probably felt guilty because even though she was exercising her genius, she probably felt like she was poking holes in things.
Exactly. And here's the crazy thing about it. Now we can appreciate that. We can also say to her, if she's doing it at a stage where it's not that appropriate, we could say, hey, Amy, we love your wonder, but we're actually in implementation mode. So I think we probably need to put that on pause.
Yeah.
Without saying like, why aren't you bought into this?
Totally.
Having the language changes everything. We've gotten so many notes from people that said they see themselves differently. They see their spouse or their colleagues differently. And we are thankful that is the case.
Yeah. And it really is the difference from not just relieving guilt, but celebrating people. It's like, rather than the fundamental attribution error, it's like, what is the reverse error where we're attributing and celebrating the things that other people have that we don't? I mean, What a wonderful byproduct of this, and what a wonderful way to live at work and in your relationships at home, to be able to sit across from someone and celebrate what they do well.
Just today, I have a relative, a dear friend and relative of mine in the office, and I love being with this guy, but he drives me crazy sometimes. And I'm going out to join him in a meeting in a second. And he did the assessment because he's visiting, and he's a W. And he's constantly going, but what about this? But what about that? And I'm like, come on, man, can't you move on? And I when I realized that, I was like, of course you do that. Mm-hmm. You love that. That's your genius. And it went from he annoys me to, oh, now I get why he does that, and I can play with that. And there are times when I can go, yeah, let's set the W aside for a moment.
Yep. Which we all have to do. It's not just the W. We all have to set aside our,
Yeah. I say that because my wife's a W. Both of the children that live at home with me are W. I'm surrounded by W's. And now I can love on that, even though I used to think it was kind of annoying.
Yep.
Not that I ever do anything that annoys them. That's the benefit of all this. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. And let's just be thankful for the fact that we can reduce the guilt and judgment that we feel that's unnecessary, and feel better about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and who we are. All right? Thanks for joining us today, everybody. And we will talk to you next time on Working Genius Podcast. God bless.